the result was pretty clear to me. I just want to talk about the estimates and just looking here in some of your opening comments, actually, in vote finance, a significant amount of the appropriation for finance goes to servicing debt, around 80%. And I think in your opening comments, you actually mentioned the idea of having a debt ceiling of 50% moving to 40%. Going forward, have you given consideration to other settings where, say a debt ceiling could be over 100% or 120% and what that could do to New Zealand economy and the vision for New Zealand? And
look, I am aware of those who believe that we should have a huge spending party today and leave our kids to clean up the mess. I reject that view. That has consequences both in the immediate term, because debt accumulation has a couple of immediate costs for an economy. The first is in terms of debt servicing, money that then is spent on an interest bill, often to people we are borrowing from offshore, but also in terms of the credit ratings that New Zealand is able to achieve and therefore the rate at which New Zealand is able to borrow. In the more medium term, an economy that is weighed down by that level of debt faces a very significant crisis point when it then needs to extend that borrowing to respond to a shock or crisis, because it may be news to some around this table, but the world doesn't owe us a living. There is no UN requirement that when New Zealand wants to borrow money, someone has to lend. What we need to demonstrate to the world is that we are worthy of credit, that we are able to pay our bills. And if we were to exceed our debt ceiling significantly, we could put ourselves in a position where a future generation would be faced with real austerity. That is having to cut actual levels of spending in order to keep an economy afloat. And I think it would be irresponsible for this government to put New Zealand in that position.
Just as a supplement.
Yeah, we've got a, have you got
quick
we'll
it did allude specifically to...
No, it's all right. The opposition had a view on me interrupting a primary before, so we're going to go continue with
what's up. Obviously tied to this too is, and you mentioned in your opening comments, obviously there's government debt and the track for that, but obviously also government deficit. I think you mentioned obviously over 25, 26, about 12 billion. But you also did look at other options that if the government actually hadn't consolidated its fiscal position and made changes, I think you said it could be looking at 23.4 bids. Again, I'm just really interested in your thinking about obviously going through all of the government spending and actually trying to consolidate it and actually changing that deficit track.
Yeah, well, look, obviously, there isn't a day I wake up where I don't think of the many areas that New Zealanders would wish to see the government be able to afford to invest in. And any finance minister faces choices about which investments they can and can't make. But in a discretionary way, when we make decisions to be more disciplined at the margin, that cumulatively adds up to much healthier books. So just to take you back to those numbers, if we had not made the savings we made in last year's budget, which was a deliberate choice that we made, and if we had not made the savings we delivered in this year's budget, then very quickly our fiscal position would have deteriorated significantly, such that in the coming fiscal year, the deficit would be $23.4 billion versus the $12 billion that we are instead achieving. And very quickly, by the end of the forecast period, instead of the debt curve curving down to 46%, we would find ourselves over the ceiling at 53.8%. My point is discretionary decisions to put a stitch in time now add up over the medium to long term, and by applying that discipline we put the New Zealand economy in a much stronger position to provide better choices for future governments and for future generations.
You're done, Mr. Stevenson. We're going to go to supplementary from
just
both
to
Robert and then Dr. Megan.
Your comments before. What sounds more like...
Have you noticed something?
Yeah.
The opposition is female-led only, and the government is male-led only. The members of the government members are all men, and the opposition members are all women.
Oh, in that committee, yeah.
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 Yeah, I thought that was quite. I was like noticing that. It's like, huh? Considering that isn't the case of most select committees.
I mean, I was more just focusing on what was being said rather than the gender of everyone. But
yeah,
I don't know what Nikki is talking about because borrowing has increased under her watch. She's giving out all these tax cuts, right? The money has to come from somewhere. Where's she getting it from?
Yeah.
She's borrowing.
Yeah, it's coming from somewhere. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, let's hear some such supplementaries. Oh.
That so-called spending party that you alluded to, planned, credible investment in our infrastructure that we borrow for, which increases our resilience, or borrowing for tax cuts, as you did?
Well, unfortunately, we only have recent history to go by, and I would rather judge by results than notions of a newfound commitment to fiscal restraint and credibility. Over the past 6 years, when the last Labor government went on a spending party of levels quite outside what had occurred in our other economic history, the result of that was pretty clear. More than $120 billion of extra debt, very little productive infrastructure assets to show for it, a significant spike in inflation and interest rates, a strangling of genuine, real economic activity. And for many New Zealanders, they were left at the end of that period worse off, not better off. So it's easy to talk about making careful fiscal choices, but the evidence is that when Labor Green governments are given the chequebook, they do not make wise choices.
Okay, one more sup, and then we're going to go to for a sup, and then sustain from Dr. Wood.
Sorry, you need to impose some order on this committee.
I do, however, just respectfully, Minister, want to ask there, because in a number of your questions, you yourself have disaggregated the spending that that was necessary over COVID in order to respond to that shock, which in our back and forth, you have admitted and accepted that Standard & Poor's upgraded our credit rating as a result of the credibility of that spending plan. You
Well,
recognise,
I don't think that that's what happened, but okay.
okay, but you accept that the response to COVID was something which is quite different from the proposal which the Greens have on the table, given that you've alluded to our fiscal strategy time and again in your answers, which is planned, credible and transparent investment in our productive infrastructure and our economic resilience.
Look,
Do you accept that those two things are
Look,
different?
I'm sorry, Chloe, but I do not accept that a plan that seeks to confiscate tens of billions of dollars of New Zealanders' assets, savings and income in the form of new taxes would be good for the productivity of our economy. I do not accept that burdening the New Zealand economy with tens of billions of more debt on the promise that somehow the Greens would decide that cycleways and light rail are no longer important and the productive investments would be made in the future is credible. I am prepared to concede. At least you have a plan. We don't even know whether Labor want more debt or
No,
tax,
okay.
less spending.
Okay.
So I'll give you that.
Thank you. Thank you. We're going to go to a supplementary. Yeah,
Quick
Mr. Stevenson.
Minister, Ms. Fulbright talked about using the government basically balance sheet to invest in infrastructure. Obviously, that's one way. In your budget and over the forward period looking forward, does the government have other policies to actually deliver infrastructure for Kiwis that actually doesn't involve just investment by the government?
Yeah, look, this is a very good point because I do accept the argument, which I think Chloe is making, which is that New Zealand has a need for investment in productive infrastructure and that is a important part of the investment decisions we make. But we also have choices about how we fund that infrastructure. And part of that should be funded by taxpayer funds, by Crown revenue. But part of that can also be funded by the private sector, by levies, by fees for those who benefit from the use of that infrastructure. And the very real example that New Zealand has had under successive governments is that, for example, our electricity transmission infrastructure is in fact funded by electricity users. Our electricity generation infrastructure is funded by the shareholders of electricity generation companies and then in turn by the consumers of electricity. So there are models for providing infrastructure which don't necessarily immediately require the government first. The question should always be, as I come back to, is this the best marginal use of a taxpayer dollar, and are they the ones that will get the most benefit out of this investment? In some cases, that is really clear. You know, building public health hospitals, building classrooms is a public good for which it's appropriate that the taxpayer fund. But that doesn't mean you get off the hook for making sure that you are making those investments as prudently as possible. You know, one of the achievements of the Education Minister is that she has reduced the average cost of a classroom from over $1.2 million to, I believe at last count, less than $800,000 through using modular builds, off-site construction. That effectively means that the taxpayer purse can go further in terms of the infrastructure delivered from the public dollar.
Thank you. We're going to have one. We're going to have one sup here, and then we're going to go to sustained questioning by the Honourable Dr. Megan Wood.
So just on that point,
last one.
On that point of prudence, can you tell me specifically what is prudent about not having a cap on the investment boost policy?
Because what we want to see is the maximum amount of investment and productive assets in this economy to drive productivity and wage growth. And one of the examples that has been raised publicly is, oh my goodness, this might mean that someone comes from overseas and invests in a major manufacturing facility, a major wind farm, and therefore is able to pay less tax on those assets. Well, I say, bring it on. Because if people want to come
What
and make
happens to the
significant
wind farm
investments
that left,
because of the investment
Nikki?
boost policy, investments they wouldn't have otherwise made, then that is the policy. we
And
want.
just to be clear, that extends to
Last
OM
one, Chloe.
Yeah, just to be clear, that logic applies to your open door for OMV investing in new oil and gas and fossil fuel.
Yeah.
Because your policy does enable that.
Look, I do want to be clear that that is a matter which I have not been involved in the deliberations and decision making on due to my adherence to the cabinet manual. So I'm not the best placed minister to talk to that
But
policy.
investment boost in particular would allow for OMV, a multinational fossil fuel corporation, to come over here and get access to effectively that taxpayer subsidised investment.
Well, the advice we had from the IRB is that the way to make this policy the most effective was not to rinky-dink it with exclusions and exceptions, that by having a broad base to the policy, we would have the least distortionary effect on investment choices. The better way to make those choices is through regulation and through the government's rules. And I would put to the member that the decision by the last government to ban offshore oil and gas exploration is one of the most real things that has driven up electricity prices and the cost of living for
takes
every
16
single
years.
New Zealander.
Right,
And you can get in shame about that policy.
Okay, thank you. Order. Can we?
I'm just waiting for the part where Chloe just smashes the desk with her head. I've seen photos. I'm waiting for it. It's like she's like our policies are resulting in great investments, and it's like you just forgot about the wind farm that left, didn't you?
Yeah. Like, what about they had the lapse resource consent?
It's like,
How
oh,
do you
whoops.
magically come back because you've changed the policy? You know, like here's the thing is that deduction is a tax deduction. It's not a tax refund. So investment boost is just 20% in addition to standard depreciation.
Mm-hmm.
It's, you know, and like the other thing is, it doesn't actually show up on your books until you file your IR4 and your IR10 in the next financial year.
I just don't know why Nikki keeps bitching about the other side, you know, complaining about, oh, look how much they're spending. Look, Nikki, you need to invest, okay? it doesn't matter what side you're on. Every party has to invest. We have a lack of public infrastructure. We have a lack of. I mean, our infrastructure is falling apart. At some point, you got to invest. So there's no point in throwing jabs at Labour and Greens for wanting to also invest in infrastructure when you're doing the same thing.
Yeah.
It's just stop it. You're just playing stupid games at that point.
Yep. So true.
Like the debt's still going up under National.
Yeah.
Because the cost of borrowing's gone up.
Yeah. Okay.